Christina here for a quick tutorial on cookie dough, and I'm going to go into some tips and tricks on what you can do to prevent your dough from spreading and other preferences that you may have, and I'll go into detail with each ingredient and then we'll go from there. So for our cookie dough recipe, it's pretty basic ingredients. We have butter, sugar, vanilla eggs, baking powder, salt, and flour. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to mix our sugar and butter. But before we do that, I want to go into a little bit of tips about your butter. It's important to make sure that your butter is at room temperature before mixing with your sugar, but it's also important that it's not too soft. It really can play a role on the cookie dough itself on whether or not it'll spread. And it's important to not heat your butter up super fast. Like if you're in a pinch for time, I wouldn't recommend putting it in the microwave because it won't heat evenly, and there'll be a lot of melted butter, which can cause your cookie dough to spread. If your butter's too soft, your dough will spread. So we usually leave it out overnight, but you can do it for 1 to 2 hours. Our apartment's pretty cool though. It's probably maybe like 65 degrees. So definitely if you live in a warmer area, I wouldn't recommend leaving it overnight because it'll be a melted mess. So one of the tricks we do to know if the butter's perfect and ready for mixing is I'm gonna go ahead and put my finger in the dough, and you're gonna see it's gonna leave like an imprint, but it's not gonna be too hard. Another thing that you can do, which it can be a little messy, is you're gonna wanna bend your butter a little bit so you see how it's bending, but it's not quite breaking. That's how you know your butter is at a good temperature. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and mix the butter and the sugar. Now usually for our KitchenAid, I just go ahead and put it on stir. I don't mix it at a high speed because I don't want too much air to get in there. You can see there's like butter kind of sticking, so I'm just gonna push it down so it mixes with the sugar. Okay, so that looks pretty good. As you can see, it's very thick combination. There's not too much air in there. So now we're ready for the next step, which is the vanilla. And we're just gonna mix that a little bit. Okay. The next step we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and mix the eggs. But before we do that, I wanna touch base on the eggs. One of the things that I've learned throughout the years of trying to master my recipe is that the temperature of the eggs is very important. If you have cold eggs, it will not mix that well with the flour. So it's important to have your eggs at room temperature because it'll mix well with the flour and it will make your cookies fluffier. Now what you can do is you can leave the eggs out for 1 to 2 hours before using them, or if you're in a rush, you can put your eggs in hot water. Now, I wouldn't recommend doing boiling hot water. It's just hot water just to get it to room temperature for a couple minutes. We're gonna go ahead and mix it in. Okay, so that pretty much looks good, and we're now ready to move on to all the rest of our dry ingredients. So next we're gonna go ahead and mix in the salt and the baking powder. And I wanna touch base on the baking powder because I know everyone has a preference, and some people think baking powder can make or break your recipe, and in a way, yes and no. I would say just use it appropriately. Don't use too much of it. And I recommend actually using some, because if you don't use any baking powder, your cookie could be very dense. But again, this is a preference on whatever you prefer. So with the baking powder, if you use too much baking powder, what can happen is that it will rise, it will fluff up, and it immediately flatten out, which will make it lose its shape. And it's taken me a couple years to really figure out the right amount of baking powder for my recipe. Go ahead and mix that. And there it is. Now the last step is going to be the flour. You see here I have a ton of flour. This recipe is actually a double batch, so I usually make a ton of cookies at one time. So what I am doing is I'm going to add the flour, and one of the tricks here is to make sure you're adding, again, not too little flour and not too much. If you put too much flour, your cookie's going to dry out. You want to add enough flour so that your cookie dough will, once it's done, it will come off of the mixing bowl, and you'll see at the end of this. And I usually put in all the flour at once. You can put it little by little. It's whatever you prefer. And again, when mixing it, I really don't do a high speed. I really just do it on the stir and just let it slowly mix itself. So as you can see, it's not sticking to the mixing bowl, which means it's almost done. I'm going to let it mix a little more. So that looks pretty much done. I'll go ahead and take it out just so you can get a closer look of what the dough looks like when it's done. So I usually let my dough chill for maybe 1 to 2 hours, and then I'm ready to go. So I make my dough most of the time the same day that I bake. You can also leave it in the fridge overnight. It's really whatever you prefer. So I mix it up a little bit, just make it into a ball. That's pretty much my dough. I'm not going to be baking immediately, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it in saran wrap, and I will roll it out just a little bit, not too much. Roll it out just a little bit. Just make sure it's completely wrapped. That is the dough, and that's how I store it in the fridge until I'm ready to roll it out and start baking. One of the things I also wanted to talk about was my not so fancy rolling pin. I get a lot of questions of where I get my rolling pin from, and honestly, it was a gift probably from our wedding shower years ago, so I'm not really sure. I attached to this rolling pin and I refuse to buy it, or I just haven't bought a new one. They're very inexpensive. And I usually roll out my cookies to be about a 1/2 inch thick, and I got these rings on Amazon, and I can link them below just so you can see. This one's a 1/2 inch. It came in a pack of 4. We'll link it below. So our dough's pretty much done. What I'll usually do now is I'll go ahead and just put this in the fridge for a couple hours until I'm ready to start baking. And some of the things that I do when I bake is I will roll out my dough, cut out the cookies, and I will actually put the cookies in the freezer for about 10 to 15 minutes before I put them in the oven. So I just want to recap again what we went over. Now, I started off with a very basic recipe a couple years ago, and over the years I have tweaked it down to what pan I use. I use parchment paper when I bake, the amount of time, the amount of baking powder, the eggs being at room temperature, the amount of vanilla, sugar, everything took years to really come together. And what we'll do is we'll link below just a general recipe that I started out with, because everyone has their own preference, and it's really going to take trial and error of what you prefer and how you would like your cookie dough to taste. You might not want vanilla, you might want a different flavor, but this is kind of the basic and where we started. And just some of the key things to think about, especially about spreading, is the temperature of the eggs, making sure that they're at room temperature so they mix better with your flour and they make a fluffier cookie. Amount of baking powder. Too much can cause the cookie to rise and flatten out quickly and lose its shape. And the temperature of the butter is very, very important. You don't want too soft butter because your cookies will spread. So that is pretty much it. Please, 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 if you have any other questions, anything I didn't cover that you may want more specifics on, please leave a question below and we'll get back to you. And please leave us feedback. How did we do? Is there something else that you would like to see? Our next tutorial will be on royal icing because I get a lot of questions about that, so I want to go over that. And thank you so much for watching. We really appreciate it. And until next time.